Okay, here is a panchromatic image of a Bruce Canadian nuclear power reactor. There are 2 units, one is here, Bruce A, and here is a Bruce B. 4 units and 4 units there. This is now actually shut down. Now, how do I know that these reactors are operating? Mind you, if I blow it properly, big thing, you can see a lot of details here. You can see the shape of the buildings and so on. So I can actually interpret, for example, this is an old reactor, but here we have a heavy water production plant, which is an important element for the nuclear reactor, for this kind of reactor. Now, how do I know that these are functioning? We go into the multispectral image, and it's the same area. And what do I see? Red plumes coming out of these 4 outputs. This is a top reactor here, and this is a bottom reactor here. And there's a little bit coming out here, which is from the heavy water. Now, these are all these nuclear facilities and also chemical facilities. They require cooling one way or the other. You can cool them either using constructing a huge cooling towers, as we are very accustomed to seeing these, or you can use water, circulate it around your system, and then put it back in the water reservoir. That's exactly what's happening. The remnants of the cooling water in the nuclear facility is being ejected into the lake here. And that's what you're seeing, warm water. Now, if that warm water turns on and off every 2 months, I know that the Canadians are not using this as a power reactor, but they are actually producing plutonium. Because that's what you need to do. If you're using a power production, you can't afford to turn the reactor on and off. It becomes uneconomical and it just doesn't work. So a plutonium production plant will turn on and off every few weeks or few months, and you can see the thermal changes. So here is a very powerful technique to see verify whether a country is producing plutonium or not. Let me run through quickly. Now, people have argued that you can't use, you've got only 2 or 3 satellites, and they take time to go around the Earth, or the Earth takes time to come back under the satellite, because see what happens is, here are the orbits of satellite. Oh, these are orbits of the satellite. This is a typical Indian set of satellites going around the Earth, and the Earth underneath turns. So satellite just whizzes in one orbit, but the Earth turns. So then it can scan. Now it takes time for the Earth to go around, 24 hours to come back to the same point. So people say, well, you might actually miss things. So what I'm arguing, and that is usually called the temporal resolution. In other words, how quickly a satellite can come back to the same point. So I've argued in recent times that here is Indian satellite orbiting in different orbits, and there are 6 of them. And that gives them a very high temporal resolution. Satellites can come back on the same point fairly quickly. Now, if we establish a cooperation between the international community, if the US does the same, and the Indians do the same, Chinese, and they all pull together and say, hey, we've got a set of satellites here which whiz around the globe, constantly virtually looking at it. Why don't we pull? Now that's unacceptable today, but it might come. One of these days it will work. So here is a temporal resolution. So we have now done spatial resolution. In other words, you can see very small things. We have seen the spectral resolution. We can see very colors of different kinds. And now we can see very often, frequently, the temporal resolution. So you see, and all of this is openly available. If Jasani can sit at the desk and work these things out, the governments ought to be able to do better. So, question is, are the satellite pictures enough? No, they are not. Many open sources of information are available, and that has to be used. Because how do I know? I don't have the capability of buying satellite pictures and just monitor continuously. So one looks at the scientific journals, newspapers, universities, institutions, go to conferences, and you gather all kinds of information in your head, and then come back to your desk and take one of these pictures and say, like, here is a thing that was mentioned by somebody that North Korea is doing something. So let's try and get a picture and then work that way. So examples of open literature is grey literature, like government documents which are available but not easily, you have to make an effort to get them, but you can get them. And then you've got Jane's publication, which describes weapon systems in enormous detail. They give you diagrams as well with the dimensions. So if you remember my satellite image of the aircraft, I can just take a line drawing of the aircraft from Jane's, and then because these are scaled, I can just superimpose on my image and say, ah, this is B-52. So you see, now I can in detail verify the thing. So let's consider very quickly monitoring some of the things. And I've done, and I won't go through all of that. I've monitored the whole, I've classified the whole of the nuclear fuel cycle. And in other words, the reactors, reprocessing plants, enrichment facilities, and so on, and described them. So that when an interpreter looks at the satellite image, he takes my key, and if it fits my key, he will say, ah, this is a nuclear reactor. So this thing is now being used by the European Union. This is one of the projects that I was involved for the European Commission, and I constructed the key for them. Why do I want to nuclear fuel cycle? Let me just remind you very quickly. There are only two fissile materials that are usable for nuclear weapons, or have been used for nuclear weapons: plutonium-235, rather 239, and uranium-235. Uranium occurs in nature, but it has to be enriched. So you have an enrichment facility. It has to be concentrated from 0.7% to something like 90% to make it into a weapon. Plutonium doesn't exist in nature, but if you irradiate uranium with neutrons, it will convert into plutonium. But if you irradiate uranium too long, it will start to build up a lot of other junk in it, other plutonium isotopes, which you cannot separate, and therefore you cannot use them in a nuclear weapon. Because while you're holding the nuclear weapon in your hand, it might blow up. So you need a very pure plutonium. So when people argue that I can use reactor-grade plutonium to make a bomb, I just don't buy it. If it's a credible nuclear weapon, it has to be purified to pure plutonium. And similarly, uranium. Uranium-233 is also an explosive, but has not been used as a weapon because it requires a different fuel cycle. It doesn't use uranium, but it uses thorium as a starting point, and then irradiate thorium with neutrons, which will produce uranium-233. And then you can use the same technique, enrich it and so on. Now, India has a huge supply of thorium. So it's working on a thorium cycle for its power production. But that's a different game. So we have enrichment facilities, nuclear reactors, reprocessing plants, and those things to be monitored. There are two ways of acquiring there are two parts of the nuclear fuel cycle. One is a civilian one, which is just a straight through, which is a solid line here, where you get the mining, milling, you can take the uranium from the mine and then enrich it slightly, about 3%, and then you can use it in your nuclear reactors as a fuel. Or if you can enrich it to 90%, you can then go through this route and make it into a weapon. But if it's only slightly enriched, then it goes into the fuel fabrication reactor, and then burned fuel is reprocessed, and waste is storage. Okay. But if you then take from the reactor early enough, as I mentioned, where the plutonium is produced but not a dirty plutonium, you can then reprocess that and then get into the plutonium weapon cycle. So these are the two parts of the fuel cycle. So when I talk about fuel cycle, that's what I mean. Okay, we now have to say, well, now we've got no basic understanding of what we can do. Question is, where do we apply that? Now, my pet topic has been to do the regional monitoring agencies. We have created a European one, and now I've started to talk about a Middle Eastern one. I think Vijay has already mentioned that something has to be done in the Middle East. You've got a potential, one nuclear weapon state and about 2 or 3 potential weapon states in that region, and it's highly volatile. So we really need to do something before it explodes. So I've been suggesting that why not use satellite imageries to build confidence that people are not really doing anything silly, like we did in Europe, and that's European satellites.